Okay, so we're diving into a tough one today. Feeling like your husband doesn't care, like he doesn't value you. And I know for anyone going through that, well, it's just heartbreaking. So to unpack all this, we've got some really interesting perspectives to look at today.
Okay.
We've got a life coach who really focuses on building self-worth.
hmm
Then we've got a marriage counselor who's got some great advice on how to communicate in these situations.
Right.
And then a website, it's called LoveWorks.
Okay.
And they offer like solutions-based relationship advice. So kind of a range of different angles to help us figure this out.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, before we even jump in, just to acknowledge that this is a pretty common thing, feeling undervalued in your marriage.
Yeah, it really is. More common than people might think.
Right.
And, when you're in that situation, it's so easy to start questioning yourself, your worth. But I loved what the life coach said about that.
Yeah.
Your worth, it comes from within. It's intrinsic. It's not about how someone else treats you. Like, you are worthy just because you exist.
It's such an important place to start from.
Yeah.
And actually, the marriage counselor, Dr. Melody Chloe, she really emphasizes this idea of acknowledging your feelings.
Yeah.
I think that's the next step.
Okay.
Because it's so tempting to just try to ignore those feelings of hurt and loneliness.
But
Right?
totally. You push them down.
But Dr. Chloe, she says, no, actually acknowledging them, that's the first step to healing and moving forward.
So we're acknowledging our own worth. We're acknowledging our feelings. What's next?
So then Dr. Chloe, she suggests taking it even a step further and actually reflecting on those emotions, like maybe even keep a journal to kind of pinpoint those specific triggers that make you feel uncared for.
Okay.
What are the patterns?
Yeah.
What are the behaviors that keep happening in the relationship that are really leaving you feeling undervalued?
So it's like becoming a detective in your own relationship almost.
Exactly. And as you start to see those patterns, you can start to ask yourself some important questions. Like, am I doing anything that might be contributing to this? How can I encourage positive change? And that last one, that's actually from the LoveWorks website. And it's so interesting, right? Because it challenges you to look at your own role in the relationship.
Yeah.
Not just blaming your husband.
Totally. Taking ownership. Okay, so we're understanding our feelings, we're looking at our role, but I mean, at some point, we have to talk to our husbands about this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is so key.
Yeah.
But it's got to be strategic. Like all of the sources are really aligned on that. Dr. Chloe, she says the first thing is to choose a good time to talk. Calm moment, no distractions, right?
So not like in the middle of dinner prep.
Right. Not when you're exhausted, stressed out.
It's just that.
Not going to get anywhere then.
It's like trying to talk during a hurricane. Like, pointless.
Exactly. And this is where the sources get really practical. So they all say, okay, avoid accusatory language, like you statements. It puts him on the defensive, right?
Oh, like never.
Right. You never listen. Instead, focus on I statements.
So like, I feel unheard instead of you never listen.
Exactly. It's just a tiny little shift in language.
Yeah.
But it makes such a difference in how it's received. And the LoveWorks website has this great example.
Okay.
They're like, instead of saying, I wish you cared more, which is kind of vague.
Right.
Yeah, it is. They say, it would mean a lot to me if we could talk for 10 minutes each evening.
Okay.
Specific, actionable.
Okay.
Doesn't put them on the defensive.
That's good.
Right. And then, of course, communication goes both ways. Dr. Chloe, she says it's so important to listen to his side, too. Actively listen. Try to understand where he's coming from, even if you don't agree.
Empathy.
Yes. Yeah. And LoveWorks, they have this really interesting way of framing that. They say, get curious. Instead of just jumping to conclusions or criticisms, ask him open-ended questions.
Like what?
So say, he always goes back to work after dinner.
Yeah,
Instead of being like, why are you always working? Which is going to start an argument.
Yeah.
You could be like, hey, I've noticed you go back to work after dinner. I'm curious, like, why is that? Just opens it up as a conversation.
That's so much better. It's not an attack. It's an invitation to connect.
Right.
I love that. Okay, so we're communicating strategically, we're listening, but what if, even with all that, it feels like you're hitting a wall?
Ooh, yeah. That happens.
Like the conversation's just not going anywhere.
That's where this appreciation sandwich technique comes in. LoveWorks talks about this, and it's really effective.
Okay, appreciation sandwich. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's all about framing your feedback with positive reinforcement. So let's say you want him to help with the dishes, right? Instead of just being like, do the dishes.
Yeah.
You start by saying something you appreciate. Like, hey, I really appreciate how hard you've been working. Then you make the request, Would you be willing to help with the kitchen before you get back to work? And then you end on another positive note, like, I always love working with you.
Okay, so you're not just throwing a demand at him. You're acknowledging his effort.
Exactly. It makes it so much easier to hear.
That's good. Okay, so we've got our communication strategy. What else? What about support? Like, we've got to have support, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that both the life coach and another website, BetterHelp, they both emphasize. You've got to have a support system outside of your marriage.
So that could be friends, family, maybe a therapist.
Exactly. Anyone who can offer support and encouragement. And remember, seeking help, that's not a weakness.
It's strong, actually.
It is. It takes courage. And it shows that you're committed to taking care of yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so support system, check. What about taking care of ourselves, like self-care?
So important. The life coach really hammered that home. Reconnect with activities and passions that bring you joy.
So, like, what are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Anything that makes you feel alive. Could be creative stuff, spending time with friends, reading a book, whatever lights you up.
I love that. And BetterHelp, they talk about this too, right? Like creating a richer life for yourself. And it's separate from your relationship.
Yes, because your happiness shouldn't depend entirely on your husband. You deserve to have a life that you love, regardless of what's happening in your marriage.
So it's almost like taking your power back.
It is. And it sets a really healthy foundation for anything that comes next.
So true. Okay. But what about when things get really tough? I mean, despite our best efforts, Love Works, they talk about navigating these really difficult situations, like when you're actually dealing with emotional neglect. So, first of all, like, what does that even look like?
Yeah, good question. They highlight some key signs to watch out for. Things like the silent treatment, constant withdrawal, just consistently disregarding your boundaries. Like, those are red flags.
Okay, good to know. And I know BetterHelp, they talk about things to avoid doing, like common pitfalls.
Oh, right. So they're like, don't nag, don't
Mhm.
criticize, don't put even more demands on him when things are already tense.
Yeah, because that's just going to make it worse.
Right. They actually say sometimes giving him space is the best thing. But, and this is super important, make sure your needs are being met too.
So it's a balance, right? You're giving him space, but you're not neglecting yourself.
Okay, exactly. And if he needs more than just space, like if he's dealing with stress, anxiety, depression, BetterHelp says encourage him to get professional help.
That's a good point. Sometimes it's deeper than just relationship stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, we've covered a lot. We talked about recognizing our worth, communicating strategically, building support systems, self-care. What's standing out to you as, like, the biggest takeaway so far?
For me, it's that initial shift in perspective, right? Remembering that your worth comes from within. It doesn't depend on what your husband does or anyone else.
Mhm.
Like, that's huge.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
like you're taking your power back. And I think it's so important to remember that even if the relationship doesn't work out,
Yeah,
even if it doesn't, the steps you take to prioritize yourself, those are always valuable.
absolutely. It's about investing in yourself no matter what.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? What's like the next step on this journey of rebuilding self-worth?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Where do we go from here? And I think the Loveworks website actually gives us a really interesting idea. They talk about like shifting your focus.
Okay.
Instead of dwelling on all the negative stuff, they're like, look for the positive aspects of your husband and the relationship.
Okay, so instead of focusing on what's missing, we're actively looking for the good.
Exactly. Like, notice those small gestures that show he does care, even if they seem small. It's about training your brain to see what's there.
It's like, okay, maybe he didn't do this perfectly, but at least he's making an effort. But what if those positive things, they're just like really hard to find? What if you're in a situation where it feels like emotional neglect, like we talked about earlier?
Right. And that's where setting boundaries becomes so important.
Okay.
Remember, boundaries, they're like the fence around your emotional well-being.
Okay, I like that. A fence. So how do you actually set boundaries, like in a situation where you're feeling emotionally neglected?
It starts with identifying your needs. Like,
Yeah.
what are those things that are non-negotiable for you to feel respected and cared for? And then once you're clear on those needs, you got to communicate.
And we talked about that before, right? Like using I statements, being specific about what you need.
Exactly. So instead of being like, you never make me feel special, you might say, I feel really loved and appreciated when we have quality time together. Could we try to make it a priority to have a date night, like once a week?
Oh, that's a good example. It's clear, it's direct, and it's focused on what you want to happen, not just complaining about what's not happening. But what if, even with all the boundaries of the communication, he's just not receptive?
Well, first of all, you know, change takes time. It's not realistic to think he's going to change overnight,
Hmm.
especially when you're dealing with like years of patterns. And sometimes, even with our best efforts, it just doesn't work. And that's why it's so important to remember this whole journey, it's ultimately about you,
Oh, okay.
like reclaiming your power, building a life that you love, regardless of what happens with him.
So it's not about waiting for him to change so you can be happy.
Exactly. It's about taking control of your own happiness.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is focusing on your own growth, your own well-being.
That reminds me of what BetterHelp said, right? Like create a richer life for yourself. And it's independent of the relationship.
Yes, pursue those hobbies, build those friendships, prioritize self-care, all that stuff that just makes you feel good.
And it all comes back to that idea in intrinsic worth, right? Like
Yeah.
you are worthy of happiness and fulfillment, regardless of your relationship status.
100%. And even if he's not on board with making changes, you can still make those changes for yourself. Like you
Yeah.
can still choose to prioritize yourself and create a life that you love.
And maybe, just maybe, that inspires him to make some changes too.
If possible.
Mhm.
And if not, well, at least you're in a stronger position to make decisions that are good for you, whatever those might be.
This is good. I feel like we've learned so much, from that idea of intrinsic worth to setting boundaries to really creating that richer life. It's been a deep dive for sure.
It has. And it's important to remember, this is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
Rebuilding self-worth, it takes time, patience. You got to be kind to yourself. There's going to be ups and downs.
Totally. And it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to do it alone.
Oh, absolutely. And the life coach, she made a really interesting point about, the difference between asking for help and relying on someone else to fix your problem.
Oh, that's interesting.
So like asking for help, that's great. It's about getting support and guidance.
Mm.
But if you're expecting someone else to fix everything, well, that can actually undermine your own sense of like self-efficacy.
So it's more about empowering yourself.
Yes. It's about realizing you have the strength to get through this. You have the resources, even if you need a little help along the way.
I love that. Okay, so as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, what's one thing you really want our listeners to hold on to?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. You are not defined by your husband's behavior
Okay.
or by the state of your marriage. You are a valuable, worthy person, regardless of your relationship status. Like, hold on to that truth and let it guide you.
That's beautiful. And it's okay to ask for help, to not have all the answers. Like, it's okay to be a work in progress.
Perfectly said.
So, what's next? What else can our listener do to really start feeling more empowered, more confident? It's so true. Like, you are worthy no matter what. Okay, so what can our listener do to really start feeling that, like, more empowered, more confident in herself?
Well, the life coach, she talked a lot about self-validation.
Okay.
And I think that's a big piece of this. It's about recognizing your own strengths,
Hmm.
your accomplishments, the good things about you, basically giving yourself the credit you deserve instead of waiting for it from someone else.
So instead of looking to your husband for that validation, you're doing it yourself. But what does that actually look like? Like, how do you do that?
It can be really simple.
Yeah.
Like take a few minutes each day and just like think about what you've accomplished. Big or small, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Like maybe you totally nail that presentation at work, or maybe you finally cleaned out that junk drawer that's been driving you crazy. Just anything,
Yeah.
Take a moment and celebrate those wins.
I love that. It's like, yeah, I did that. Good for me. Acknowledge your own awesomeness.
Exactly. And actually, remember that appreciation sandwich technique we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
LoveWorks. They suggest using that same approach when you're talking to yourself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So instead of focusing on like your flaws or the things you don't like about yourself, try sandwiching those thoughts between two positive affirmations.
So, like, for example, if you're feeling insecure about how you look, maybe you could say something like, I have a beautiful smile, even though I wish my hair was thicker. And I have amazing friends who love me for who I am.
Exactly.
Yeah.
See, you're consciously shifting that focus.
It's like being your own best friend, right?
Exactly. And speaking of friends, the life coach and BetterHelp, they both talk about how important it is to have a good support network, surrounding yourself with people who lift you up.
And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to, like, tell everyone your problems.
Right, not at all. It's more about spending time with people who make you feel good about yourself, who
Right.
encourage you, celebrate your success, just bring that positive energy.
It's like filling your life with good vibes and genuine connection.
Exactly. And sometimes that also means, seeking professional support from a therapist.
Okay.
They can provide like a safe space to process your emotions, get some new perspectives, learn some healthy coping strategies.
Like having a personal coach, but for your mental health.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to that question from earlier. Like, what's the next step? What's the next step on this journey of rebuilding self-worth?
I think the most important next step is honestly just to start. Do something today, even something small. Whether it's, writing in a journal, giving yourself a compliment in the mirror, calling a friend, even those tiny steps forward can make a big difference over time.
Yeah, it's about momentum, right? Like taking that first step and then just keep moving forward one day at a time. And, you don't have to do this alone. There are resources out there, people who get it, a whole community rooting for you.
That's so true. And, as we close, I want to leave our listener with one final thought.
Yeah.
Imagine yourself a year from now, feeling confident, empowered, totally connected to your worth. What's that version of you like? What's she doing? How does her life feel? Hold on to that vision.
Mm,
Let it be your guide. You got this.
I love that. Such a powerful image to hold on to. And that's it for our deep dive today on rebuilding self-worth when it feels like your husband doesn't care. If you're going through this, remember, you are not alone and you are worthy of love and happiness. Take care of yourselves, everyone.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode. If you found this conversation helpful or relatable, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others who might benefit from it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means a lot, and it helps us bring more valuable content just for you. See you in the next episode.